China and the United States hold high-level discussions on economic and trade ties in Beijing. Hi, everyone. I'm Sean Calebs, and I'm sitting in for Anna Naidu, and you are watching The Heat. Welcome, everyone. Chinese Premier Li Qiang met with U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo in Beijing on Tuesday. Li calling for the two nations to reduce friction and confrontation and to promote economic recovery and cope with global challenges. Raimondo is the fourth high-ranking U.S. official to travel to China this summer in an attempt to improve relations between the world's two top economies. And we're going to begin with this report from CGTN's Kaiyi in Beijing.
It's a pretty packed schedule for Gina Raimondo during her four-day visit to China. Today, she met China's Premier Li Qiang in Beijing. The Chinese Premier mentioned that recently there has been a noticeable increase in dialogue spanning various sectors between China and the United States. This engagement has garnered positive attention and recognition on a global scale. He emphasized that constructive dialogues are essential for comprehending each other's concerns and identifying common ground. He also said that the economic and trade relationship serves as a cornerstone for China-U.S. relations, and when managed effectively, it benefits both nations as well as the international community. Raimondo said that during the first 2 days of her visit, there has already been productive exchanges with Chinese officials. Earlier on Tuesday, she met with Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng. Other than that, we've learned that boosting travel and tourism is a big part of Raimondo's trip this time. Today, she also met with China's Minister of Culture and Tourism, agreeing to hold the 14th China-U.S. Tourism Leadership Summit in China in the first half of 2024. Experts I spoke to believe that the high frequency, if you will, of the recent visits paid by U.S. high-level officials really shows the urgency of both sides getting together and having that in-person, face-to-face talks to work on some of the existing challenges. And they believe a bunch of concrete outcomes this time have been reached, such as the establishment of new communication channels and new working groups set up to resolve business frictions. So all these actions showing that the bilateral relationship is moving toward a right direction.
Now, for more on China-U.S. trade, we're going to bring in our panel. Joining us from Portland, Oregon is Yan Liang. She is a chair professor of economics at Willamette University. From Pittsburgh, Anthony Moretti. He's an associate professor with the Department of Communications and Organizational Leadership at Robert Morris University. And here in Washington, D.C., James P. Moore, the founder and CEO of the Washington Institute for Business, Government, and Society. I want to thank you all for joining us. And Yan Liang, I'd like to start with you. If we take things so far over the past half year or so, this is the fourth high-level visit. Going back through, we had climate envoy John Kerry, the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, as well as Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, and now the Commerce Secretary in China, having discussions that are characterized as rational, candid, and constructive. Kind of break things down for me where you think they stand now after what have been years of very tense relations between these two nations.
Good to talk to you, Sean. I think, first of all, I think these visits really symbolize that, two countries really value their relationships. And as you mentioned, this is the fourth visit of the high-level officials, and the conversations have been really productive and candid. And I think this is great because this is the first time in 5 years the Commerce Secretary set foot in China after the pandemic and really tense relationship in the past few years. And I think this is a good start, and there's some already tangible results from the visit. For example, both sides have agreed on yearly ministerial level meetings and also form a working group to talk about exchange information on especially things like export restrictions. So I think all these communications would be wonderful. This would be really a good communication channel for both sides because I think both sides recognize that trade and commercial activities are the cornerstone of the relationships between the two countries. So despite all the strained, I think, relationships, there's still a lot of room for corporations, and also there's a lot of need to rekindle economic recoveries in both countries and for the rest of the world. So I think this is a really good starting point.
I'm curious, Yan Liang, how you think Beijing is looking at these discussions, because they've often used the phrase, we want win-win, we want mutual respect, but without question, it has been a contentious few years.
Absolutely. I think there's definitely a lot of sticking points. For example, I think from the United States point of view, competition is still the guiding principle when dealing with China, but they wanted to prevent the competition from sliding into conflict. But for China, as you just mentioned, the catchphrase is, we want to have a win-win cooperation. So there's definitely a lot of, contentions still, especially when it comes to, this idea of de-risking, where the United States said they're not going to compromise on these all sort of national security issues, and yet they're very vague in terms of how to define those issues and how not to politicize, trade and commercial activities with that sort of national security concerns. And I think China will continue to push on that because they still see the kind of, restrictions on high-tech exports to China as a way to confront China and contain China's growth. So I think that point is going to continue to be the sticking point, and not one visit or two could solve the problem.
James, good to see you again as well. I want to talk to you about the worldview, because the United States has said and is saying it wants competition, not confrontation with China. And the Commerce Secretary has been quoted as saying this meeting right now is about maintaining consequential trade, which is good for China, good for the United States, good for the world. Pick up on that, if you will, please.
Well, there's no question that the United States and China have been going through perhaps the most difficult period that they have had in the past couple of decades at least. The United States has been very concerned about some of the developments in China. There's been a little bit of lack of transparency, at least that's what U.S. government officials have been concerned about. I've known the Secretary of Commerce and at one time was at the department, having the Chinese portfolio. But there have been concerns about the fact that no longer are statistics of a certain kind, economic statistics, being shared. We were looking forward here in Washington for the Chinese foreign minister to come to Washington in the aftermath of Secretary Blinken's being in Beijing, and then he was no longer in office. But we're, I think, very empathetic to the notion that China is going through a difficult period of time. The United States certainly has been in the midst of this itself over time, but there has been less consumer spending. The real estate sector has been depressed. We're looking at a stock market that has been going down. Youth unemployment has gone up. Direct investments have gone down. Wow. There have been some concerns about some of the restrictions that are being placed on foreign companies going into China. And so these are the kinds of things that are very much on the mind of U.S. government officials as well as business leaders.
James, I could see you nodding your head yes to a lot of what Anthony was just talking about. I'd like you to kind of pick up, if you will, James, on I'm sorry, Anthony, excuse me, I apologize. Anthony, I saw you nodding your head. If you could pick up just a little bit about what James said.
No, I agree. I think we're at a stage now where we're seeing sort of low bars for success, but nevertheless consistent bars for success. Climate and trade, climate and economics, or environment and economics, I think being the two areas in which the United States and China, I think everybody agrees, are cornerstones upon which they can rebuild some trust. But on the other hand, as you look as James outlined, some of the challenges that China faces, I think on some level what they're looking at is not necessarily relief or compassion or anything along those lines, but a recognition that some of this is induced by, or at least likely to be induced by, the tariffs that have been in place and remain in place. Right. That the U.S., in other words, has to do more than say, hey, we understand this is a tough time, but look for ways to come up with concrete solutions to make some of those tougher times a little easier for people to bear. And I think that's one of the challenges with these consistent visits at this point. Yes, they have had lots of good smiling faces, as we've seen. There's been some constructive dialogue, as we've seen. But now what will we see constructively and substantively follow? If we don't see anything, then at the end of the day, these were 4 trips to China that, although they had some symbolism would not have had enough substance.
Anthony, I'd like to follow up on that. Let's talk about getting beyond the niceties, getting beyond the politeness. We heard Yan Liang earlier talk about a working group. I would like all of you to listen to what the Chinese minister had to say about this proposed working group and what it could bring to the table.
We are ready to work with Washington to foster a more favorable policy environment for cooperation between the two countries' businesses, to bolster bilateral trade and investment in a stable manner, and to inject stronger impetus into the world economic recovery.
So, Anthony, follow up to that. Does this have the potential to get beyond just the politeness?
I think it has to. And what I mean by that is that, that there is an old joke that if Washington catches a cold or if Washington sneezes, the entire world catches a cold. Well, now it's if Washington or Beijing sneeze, the entire world catches the cold. And so, what we need to see are some constructive events to follow. And, we've talked about this in other platforms, but the calendar right now is not necessarily working in favor of the United States perhaps being proactive. We know we're only a couple of months away until 2024. Americans are going to, of course, begin to focus a little more on the primaries and eventually the general election and whatever transforms there. Certainly, Donald Trump's going to do everything he can to dominate the headlines, or at least to attract some headlines. So the constructive work, to some extent, really begins after you get the symbolic visits out of the way. James made a good point. It would be good to see some Chinese officials coming to the United States, not necessarily so that there's this symbolic balance of, 4 trips here, 2 trips there. It's not a numbers game.
Right.
The sense that the more they're meeting and the more they're talking and the more they find a framework that can be built, the better off it's going to be for everybody.
Okay, I'd like to bring into our little discussion Victor Gao. He is a chair professor with Soochow University in Beijing. And Victor, always a pleasure. I presume you did have a chance to hear what Anthony was just talking about. What about Chinese officials, the same kind of cabinet level officials that have been going to China? Could we see this reciprocation, Chinese officials coming to the United States, perhaps break the ice?
Thank you very much. I think Secretary of Commerce visit to China right now is a very important one, and in my judgment is the most equitable meeting that has been taking place between China and the United States in the recent months. And this is really very encouraging for dealing with issues in China-U.S. relations on an equal basis with the same commitment, try to resolve the issues rather than to blow the issue out of the pictures. In that spirit, I believe it is really time for more important exchanges of visits between China and the United States, and it is time for the Chinese officials to make official visits to Washington. I also hope that given the fact that President Biden and President Xi Jinping of China are expected to have sideline summit meetings at the G20, etc., and the APEC summit meeting, we hope the summit meeting, which is expected to take place, will further encourage the positive development of China-U.S. relations.
Yan Liang, I keep coming back to this one paragraph that I read in some of the research that I have. Maintaining stable economic and trade ties between China and the U.S. is crucial, not only for both countries, but for the entire world. What kind of, I don't want to say pressure, but how do you think the rest of the world is looking at this relationship that has been fraught with disagreement over virtually everything from high tech on down? Do you think that there is a sense of frustration? Why can't these two get together and calm these turbulent waters?
Right. I think absolutely. I think when 2 elephants fight, the grass trembles. We all know kind of that scenario. I think all countries in the world are eyeing on the U.S.-China, sort of relationship dynamics, because when the 2 top countries work together, that means they could be a lot of cooperations in terms of, for example, fighting climate change, policy coordinations to recover the economy, and many other aspects as well. And when the countries are really sort of confronting with each other, that would mean disruptions in supply chain and also a lot of political and economic risks when it comes to which country should be the destination for investment and which countries can be cooperate with. And so that adds a lot of political and economic uncertainties for all the countries in the world. So not to mention, I think if the two countries really work their own ways and have two parallel systems when it comes to technology standards, when it comes to payment systems, when it comes to trade and investment sort of regimes, then I think that fragmentation would really hurt the entire economy. As the IMF has already talked about in many occasions, the kinds of trade fragmentation and technological fragmentation which shed 7 to 13 percentage points of the world GDP growth rates. The world GDP. So I think that it's very essential for the two countries to cooperate, not only for their own goods. And I think, I echo with what the previous panelists talked about. The kind of economic needs are mutual. The U.S. wants China's tourists, for example. There are over 3 million Chinese tourists and spend over $30 billion in the United States. So I think they really want this kinds of healthy economic relationships. But at the same time, I think we also recognize a lot of the sticking points that we talked about earlier. Right. But I echo with what Victor was just saying. When the two top leaders meet together, they probably can push through some of the more breakthroughs, because I think none of these minister level officials are able to really talk about the national security issues in a very really constructive ways.
James, the Commerce Secretary Raimondo did discuss several challenges facing American businesses, not the least of which is a long-running issue, alleged China intellectual property theft. What are U.S. business leaders looking for right now?
Well, they realize that the dynamic between China and the United States has changed fairly dramatically. Up until 2019, there was no there was no trading partner that was more important to the United States than China was. And yet we have a $700 billion two-way trading relationship. The United States is able to export $154 billion. China is sending to the United States $537 billion, and yet China is now number 3 of the top trading partners of the United States, with Mexico and Canada being number 1 and number 2. And one of the biggest concerns that I think needs to be fully appreciated, and that is the fact that there is a segment here in the United States of tremendous suspicion as to what is transpiring in China. I mentioned earlier the concern about the lack of transparency, but there now is a committee that is dedicated in the House of Representatives, headed by the chairman, Mike Gallagher, congressman from Wisconsin, that deals specifically with the strategic relationship between the two countries. States are beginning, over half the states here in the country have begun to consider legislation to restrict Chinese investment, from real estate to setting up factories. And so there is this fractious element that is really erupting here in the United States. And quite frankly, these trips that members of the Biden administration are taking to Beijing bode nothing but positive results at the end of the day, given the fact that the president himself has been criticized for being a little bit too bowing over backwards to be able to try to deal with the U.S.-Chinese relationship, and should be taking a much tougher approach than he is.
Anthony, I'd like to pick up on the trading practices that are going on, because obviously China has purchased a number of large aircraft from a European entity, but according to a Bloomberg report that just came out, U.S. plane maker Boeing is prepared to restart its delivery of the 737 MAX to China for the first time since the pandemic. What do you make of this report? And I really want to go back to what James said, to the number of states that are now taking on measures to restrict Chinese owning land or starting businesses, about these signals. How do you get past all this, and how important is this plane deal?
Well, I hear echoes of the 1980s, and then it was Japan is the boogeyman that's buying up everything, and Japan's going to own the United States, and the United States is going to be doomed, and all of this, and now it seems to be that China has become the convenient boogeyman. And the problem with the boogeyman idea is that you often have one or two, maybe three examples that you use to sort of illustrate what everything is going to be like, when in reality these are nothing more than one or two or three sort of data points in a very complex relationship. So I think what the business community is likely to say is, look, There are problems, yes. There are differences in economic approach. There's differences in political approach, all of that. No one's going to dispute that. But at the end of the day, the United States doing business with China is good for both countries and for X number of countries around the world. And likewise, China doing business with the United States is good for both countries and for the countries around the world. And so I don't think the business community is trying to say, look, politics doesn't belong in this conversation. But I think the business community is saying, please, let's not take what is the #1 strength of the bilateral relationship and put it under any more stress than it already is.
Victor, the Commerce Secretary, saying Monday during a reception that 99% of the trade between China and the United States has not been impacted by U.S. export controls. Raimondo saying, and I want to quote here, the plan and the hope is that our commercial relationship, if done right, can stabilize the political relationship. So it kind of goes to what Anthony was just talking about.
Yes, I think in China there is a lot of appreciation for the good sentiment underlying Secretary of Commerce Raimondo's speeches, as well as meetings and her overall visit to China. Because by the end of the day, China and the United States need to get along with each other despite of our differences. As a matter of fact, our diversity and differences should be a strength to further promote our bilateral relations, rather than, for example, viewing each other as the enemy, as the adversary, because otherwise we will have no sanity and no peace either for the United States or for China. For China and the United States, I think it is time to really think about how to boost our bilateral trade to, let's say, $1 trillion, and for the additional amount to be added to the bilateral trade, the United States need to do more to export more to China. And I think the demand in China, the size of the market in China is undisputed. It will be much, much, much bigger than the Canadian or the Mexican markets by any stretch of the imagination. It just takes courage and vision and wisdom to decide which direction you want to push, whether we push for greater engagement, greater positivity in bilateral relations, or, for example, becomes very pessimistic about it and try to slow down the bilateral relations. I think we need to be more bullish and more positive about China-U.S. relations.
James, earlier you said that Biden administration had kind of been criticized for perhaps bending over backward to appease Chinese authorities. But Biden has kept on the Trump administration's tariffs on Chinese imports. We hear the two words tech war a lot right now. And the U.S. International Trade Commission released a report recently that said American importers are bearing the brunt of these costs, not Chinese companies. Your thoughts on that?
Well, honestly, I really guarantee that if President Trump had a second term in office, that things would be a lot more difficult and a lot more different than they are today. We have to give the president some credit. He is, just today, for example, I was mentioning Congressman Mike Gallagher. He had an op-ed in the New York Times in which he really lambasted the Biden administration for being literally too lenient in dealing with the Chinese, particularly in the aftermath of the reopening of China after COVID. And so we certainly can point to areas where President Biden has certainly continued to be able to hold down to keep the tariffs in place, to be able to really restrict the back and forth between China and the United States. And business leaders, too, have been very concerned about having their offices being surveyed by the Chinese government authorities, concerned about some nonprofits in China from the United States. But at the end of the day, I think we are at a point where things can go up, notwithstanding what happens in the election of 2024. And so I don't think we should be throwing stones at the White House at this moment.
Yan Liang, in the many months that we've chatted on air about this, about how important China and U.S. trade is. I want to run through some numbers for you. So far this year, trade between China and the United States is about $691 billion. According to China's General Administrations of Customs, that's down nearly 10%, 9.6% from the first 7 months. Beijing is now trading more with Southeast Asia, and as we have talked about in this program, the United States is trading more with Mexico and Canada. How do we build on what James was just talking about there, and Victor as well, making China more important, if you will, to the trade deals that do go on globally?
Right. I think, very interestingly, there are a lot of also Chinese investments in Mexico and also in Southeast Asia. So I think some of these bilateral numbers doesn't necessarily capture how much Chinese companies being in China or abroad have been able to, export to the United States. That said, I agree with, your assessment, and I'm glad that you mentioned about this punitive tariffs that are still in, since Trump has installed it in 2017-18. I think, really interesting is, what would be interesting is really if the United States really walk the talks, if they're really not interested in decoupling, but rather just de-risking in a small fence, a small area, high fence manner, then I think they should really seriously consider, removing these punitive tariffs, which on the one hand, I think really obstruct trade between U.S. and China and make businesses really have to think about roundabout ways to do business. And on the other hand, like you mentioned, it really hurts the U.S. consumers and businesses. So by any measures, I think these tariffs are not going to be helpful, right, in reconstructing the business relationship between two countries. But unfortunately, I agree with what James talked about earlier. There's a lot of political hurdles for Biden administration to pay the kinds of political gesture to remove these tariffs based on sound economic rationales. So I think that is really the key, the tricky point where the politicians have really the will and also have the courage, as Victor talked about,
right,
to really do what is good and what is sound for the economies.
Gotcha. Victor, at this point, I always look at the clock and wonder where the time went. I'm going to give you 45 seconds, and I'm going to keep you to it. We talked about sharing culture and tourism, and there is going to be a tourism conference with China and the United States. How important is that, and how do they break this logjam?
Well, I hope more Chinese tourists will visit the United States as they did before COVID. All the civilian flights will be restored to the original size and the strength before the COVID, and the people-to-people exchanges between our two great countries will continue and will be further increased for our mutual benefit and to make the whole world more peaceful.
Okay, Victor, I'm hoping to get to China this year, and maybe we can share a cup of tea once I get over there. I want to thank all of our guests for this half-hour discussion. I greatly enjoyed it, and hope you did too. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Sean Calebs in Washington. Thanks for watching, everyone.